Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks so much for inviting me along, Chrissy. It's lovely to be here. There's a couple of people I actually know, so this will be a welcome audience as well. Let me just share my screen. So, I mean, this is really to sort of give a bit of an overview, talk about some of the more recent research, trends that are happening, and give an insight into sort of what's expected from seaweed, what the barriers are, and how we can get past, well, get to where we need to go. So I think really importantly, the seaweed sector is super new, compared to the likes of agriculture, which has been around for tens of thousands of years, even fish farming, which has been around for 50 years. The seaweed sector, while we've had lots of experience in wild harvesting, the potash industry, the iodine industry in Glasgow, and the industry in Bacalden that used to make alginate products as well. All of these sectors were big at one point and sort of got lost with the Industrial Revolution. So we do have a lot of history with the seaweed sector, but because we lost that traction anyway, we're almost starting from scratch. So in the last 20 years, we've kind of gone from having little to no seaweed industry to now starting to develop something. So really important to bear that in mind with all of this. So I've seen loads of different examples of this. I pulled this one out of a report, but there's been a lot of numbers knocked around that the industry is currently worth 17 billion, some it's worth 9 billion. So I think the range can really depend on who you talk to. The sector, I think in a lot of ways, when you talk to guys like economy, the sector is overinflated a lot of the time in countries like Indonesia and China, where they're a little bit more cagey about their numbers and want to present a much larger sector than they have. And the reality is actually in Indonesia, the market share of that seaweed is actually going down. So based on this report that I pulled out, the global seaweed market is projected to reach about 34 billion, 35 billion by 2028. The idea being that it's already sitting around 22 billion. The UK is an emerging part of that. We are, in comparison to other countries, we're still relatively small, especially in comparison to the likes of China, Indonesia. Even within Europe, I would say, estimated third or fourth producer of seaweed in the whole of Europe, but we're still doing pretty well, especially in terms of wild harvested seaweed. So the number of seaweed related businesses in the UK, we've seen quite a large increase. We've got about 75 to 100 seaweed industries now, depending on what you count as a seaweed industry. Is that a company that uses just seaweed products and produces seaweed products, or is it a company that utilizes seaweed in some way through an ingredient? And that's kind of where we get a little bit blurred lines there. So the current state of the UK seaweed industry. So as I just mentioned in that last slide, about 74 seaweed related businesses, and they are reflective mostly of seaweed companies that then utilize seaweed in some way. So these are biostimulants for bioplastics. If they primarily have seaweed as their source, or advertise it as the product, then that's what they're counted in this study, I believe. So talking with the guys at the Fish Site and Hatch, who put this together, this is the kind of idea. So again, pulled this from a research study, and I've seen a lot of different estimations around the UK commercial seaweed market size. A report in Scotland essentially identified that it was worth about 500,000 in direct and indirect value, and then in also gross value it's about 4 million. So it has lots of knock-on effects, especially because the seaweed sector is active in rural areas where there's not as much employment. It's also out of season employment for a lot of areas where you'll have tourism, high tourism levels in the summer, and then very little to no employment in the winter. So it provides diversification of work in those rural areas for people. So the distribution of businesses that utilize seaweed, a lot of them in either England or Scotland. In England, you're seeing the likes of Notpla, who are a huge company who are obviously making seaweed bioplastics. You've also got in Wales, companies like Carrymore, who are a community interest company. So they really grow and create seaweed products as part of the community initiative. In Scotland, you've got the likes of Shaw Crisps, if any of you have come across those before. So they were born out of a company called New Wave Foods, who are now Horizon Seaweed, who also provide the seaweed as an ingredient. And we've also got companies like Mara Seaweed, who are now Seaweed Enterprises, a lot of rebranding in seaweed as well, and really trying to find that definition. There are also some companies that you probably haven't heard of or come across as much. So those examples that I just gave, a lot of them were harvesting from farm seaweed, but there is a lot within the sector from wild harvested seaweed. So I mean, I think 16,000 tons as an estimation is quite low. Reality is, I think it's probably a lot more than that year to year, but it very much depends on the demand. So I think if total capacity was utilised, it'd be around 20,000 tons. So we've got a lot of capacity that could be harvested year on year. That isn't, but it's still a lot that is. So 20,000 tons is a fair amount. But if you compare it to the likes of Norway, Norway is harvesting around 500,000 a year. So they're significantly larger, but they do mechanically harvest, which is something that we're not allowed to do. So they go out with essentially what I would call lawnmowers on the seabed, and they harvest species of Laminaria hyperborea, usually for the alginate industry. And for those of you who might have come across it, we did have an instance back in 2018 where it was pitched to the Scottish government would do that, but in a sustainable way, where we carefully manage stocks, or a particular company carefully managed stocks and harvested up to 30,000 tons of Laminaria hyperborea. And essentially the government decided to shelve it because of a large protest from what I would say social media. Really it came from. So a lot of unhappy people, a lot of conservationists who thought it wasn't a good idea. So that was shelved back in 2018. Now everything, I guess, very similarly, it's all hand harvested, and ascophyllum, which I'll get to in a second, is the only one that's actually mechanically harvested, as far as I know. So the commercial species, I just mentioned a couple there. This is only 7 of, I would say, 10 to 15, depending on who you talk to, mostly because a lot of fucuses are commercially viable, but only at very, very small profits. So I gave one example of one fucus there, Ascophyllum nodosum, but there's Fucus spiralis, Fucus vesiculosus. All of these ones do have some commercial value, but it's very difficult to fetch a high price for them without going through lots of steps of extraction. The 3 at the bottom there, the Alaria, Laminaria and Saccharina, they're all cultivated species at the moment, and the other 4 in that example are not cultivated species. They'll be hand harvested and mostly for food. I'd say Ascophyllum is for biostimulants, and some other sectors. You might have come across, actually I've got an example here. You might have come across this Weed and Wonderful, these supplements. This is actually Ascophyllum. So the idea being that they have an iodine effect and all these other wonderful nutrients. Well, it's pretty much the same in all species of seaweed if you start digging into it. So what's now happening? I mean, I mentioned those 7 species. I say about 10 to 15 utilised commercially. The reality is we actually have 600 to 650 species of seaweed within the UK. One that I listed here that I didn't mention before is also lava. So if any of you have come across lava bread in Wales, that is the same species of seaweed, or from the same family, sorry, as nori. So if you've ever had nori sheets of seaweed or sushi, it's the same species that our ancestors grew up eating in Wales as part of their diet, and even was a part of some of the sort of healthy food that you can have, or nutritional food that you can have in some of those very, very early cookbooks that I've come across as well. So at the moment we've got, again, I mentioned wild harvesting. We are transitioning to farming, but still only at a very low rate at the moment. So I would say that those 16,000 tons wild harvested, we're only sitting at between 100 to 200 farmed right now. So it's really, really low, but the reason for that is because of sustainability, because you get much higher quality of seaweed. It will be less biofouled. You won't have rocks or grazing organisms as much in it as you would if you had to collect it from the wild. You also have certain elements of control over it, and then you can actually improve the environment, which is one of the key selling points, I think, for seaweed, especially for cultivated seaweed. You're bringing a nursery area in some cases, you're providing shelter in other cases. Marine protected areas are a big one right now, and the talk around highly marine protected areas caused obviously a lot of controversy. But one of the good things about seaweed is that it actually protects the environment it's on top of, essentially. So you don't have the fear of trawlers coming through or anything like that, because they wouldn't be able to. So current farms, I know that there are 19 licenses have been granted in Scotland. Whether or not they're all active is another question. I think about 6 of them are inactive right now. So I would say probably 13 farms currently operational. 16 licenses also in England, 1 in Northern Ireland and 1 in Wales currently. There are another 13 in Scotland that are waiting to be processed. But I'm under the impression that some of those have always also been scrapped for now. They just need to be essentially removed from the process. So I did mention earlier, yeah, that comparison. This graph is maybe a little bit misleading, because I've got on the left hand side I've got 200 tons, and on the right hand side I've got 20,000 tons. So you can kind of see the comparison there, but it looks like there's a lot more farming happening than there is. If I was to put it on the same graph, it would be right at the bottom there. So this is just to give you an idea of over time. I'd say we had a bit of a downturn in 2023, and I think it's coming back up again, but mostly that's because the farming efforts were scaled up in 2022, and a lot of the stock ended up not being utilized. So one of the big things is that buyer maintenance throughout the process. Do we have that buyer throughout the process? Can we offload the seaweed immediately? Is there a way for it to get processed immediately? And these are big questions at the moment, and one of the big challenges and bottlenecks within the sector. So I alluded to a couple of uses of seaweed. This was from a report by Elisa Capuzzo from CFAS, where she broke down some of the uses that she could find around the UK. So really, food and drink is a big one. I did mention a couple, and it's the most marketable application for seaweed. So having it in your crisps, in your chutneys, in your hot sauce, there are lots of interesting applications, seasoning products, for example, as well. It's really great to see high marketability, not high value at the moment. It's the transition to get people from not eating seaweed to eating seaweed is a huge challenge. And if we look at the marketability of it, at the moment, it's more of an uphill struggle, and you'd really struggle to get over that level unless you present people with something that they already are familiar with, for example crisps, or I've seen seaweed pestos as well, but it's difficult to get the price point to the same price as regular pesto. So where's that buyout, and markets? I think markets and marketability, big challenge for the seaweed sector. Beauty is another one. So if any of you have gone to spas around Scotland, you've probably come across Ishka, which is a seaweed based product. You also might have come across creme du lac seaweed products. Esper, I believe, do some seaweed products as well. So, you know, you can get your seaweed wrap, which full disclosure, I thought that meant that you got wrapped in seaweed, like they used to do back in historical times, or sit you in a seaweed bath. But the reality is actually it's just the extract. So they'll wrap you in a form of alginate, I believe, and then put a plastic line around you. So while it's a nice idea for a seaweed wrap, they don't have just plain seaweed anymore, which I think is a bit of a shame, but I guess it makes sense. And there's lots of historical points about seaweed being used in beauty and in skincare. There's stories from the Roman times where if people had particularly bad skin problems, they would be sent down to the rock pools and they'd have to go bathe in the rock pools, and then they'd come back doing a lot better. So the idea of that actually was that the fact that they were bathing in seaweed, which was good for them. But the sea was always kind of vilified in Roman times, and people were quite scared of the ocean. Nutraceuticals as well, big one. So you might have come across fucoidins, you might have come across iodine, you might have come across, you know, there's I'm conflating the two here, but pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals, and I mean health giving extracts, sulfated polysaccharides are a big one, and some of the things that I'm seeing coming out around that now are really big. And if we can get some of the claims to clinical trials, then I think that'll be huge. There was a woman who I saw recently, she's from the US, and I believe there was a case where she basically wrote about how breast cancer, seaweed would help with breast cancer for ages. And then I think she got breast cancer herself, and she ate 5 grams of seaweed a day and managed to actually get rid of the tumor. And so while it's kind of an anecdotal piece of research, I think she's hoping that it will then transition into actual clinical trials and maybe provide some evidence for that down the line as well. And then other uses, so animal feed, alginates, fertilizers, biostimulants, biopackaging. While there are more companies who are making them, there's less value in it as well. So some of the applications and demand drivers. So I've used a couple of examples of food here because, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the largest part of the seaweed industry in the UK is for food. So here's a couple of examples. One is meat-free alternatives, so using the protein in seaweeds to make things like tuna-free flakes. You've got the likes of John West now looking at alternative proteins using marine products, so seaweed as well. There's an example at the bottom there, sea truffle butter. Sea moss, I always thought that sea moss was the same as Irish moss, but it's not. A lot of it is actually extracted from a species, I believe it's Eucuma, which is a tropical species, whereas Irish moss specifically has to come from either Cronus crispus or Mastocarpus, so that's the false Irish moss. And they have very similar benefits to you. So I know Kim Kardashian was talking about putting sea moss in her green smoothie, and suddenly there was a huge market push for sea moss, and I think we're seeing more of that now as well, especially around social media. Some cosmetics and personal care, biofuel as well. I didn't necessarily want to put that in there, but actually we're starting to see a lot more interest in biofuel again, biofuel production. It was brought up maybe 10, 15 years ago when seaweed started coming up, and we found that it wouldn't be commercially viable. It's just almost impossible to get that price point to match. But people are interested in it again, especially in island nations where they could use biorefineries to create biofuel and make their islands self-sufficient and self-sustaining, which I think would be a huge development. Whether or not, again, that can be economically viable, I think is the big question. But with research and development, these things are changing constantly. The textile industry, if any of you have come across, there's a company in Germany called Seacell. I believe they're German anyway, and they make fiber out of seaweed. and they've made t-shirts, hoodies, all sorts of clothing. And Linda McCartney actually made a dress recently for the catwalk using that sea cell fibre. So it's really cool to see those developments happening, but also pigment extraction as well. So moving from petroleum-based pigments and dyes to creating dyes with seaweed. So Sea Dyes actually in the UK and Scotland is doing that along with Sam. So really interesting research and development around that. So what are the opportunities for seaweed? I thought I'd move on to some of the claims around it and actually why it might be really good. So this is from a climate change angle. So there are lots of threats to seaweed with climate change, but actually there's lots of opportunities for it to help. So cleaning eutrophication, I think, is a huge one. You get agricultural runoff, you get sewage, all sorts of things happening now in England with the water companies obviously releasing lots of chemicals and all sorts of things into the marine environment. So if we had seaweed farms at the points where these estuaries or these outflows were absorbing this, all the excess nutrients, we might be able to actually have a beneficial impact on it. And then we could use that seaweed and use the phosphorus, the nitrogen, and the potassium to then go back into our systems, into our fertilizers. And that's one of the big things that's happened and has affected the marine environment probably in the biggest way over the last 50 years is that overuse of fertilizers over time and that peak. And one of the things that we really have to acknowledge is the fact that phosphorus, while it's so important for us to feed ourselves, to provide crops for ourselves, it's leached out into the water and it's created these dead zones, and we've had massive areas of eutrophication as a result. One of the things as well is carbon absorption. I don't want to touch too much on this because obviously as soon as you harvest that seaweed, the carbon comes back from that. So it only really absorbs it for as long as it's there, and it will eventually break down. You'll get some detrital production, which will then go into the sediments below, but again, limited amounts actually stored. So it has potential, but only very limited potential. It improves biodiversity, again, temporarily, but it is providing a temporary habitat for that time and also protects the seabed below. Alternative livelihoods is able to help somewhat with ocean acidification. Obviously, I think we're going to see more and more of the effects of ocean acidification on seaweed stocks. But for now, I think that's maybe one of the positives. And then food security, ultimately. How do we get locally sourced food? Not only does seaweed provide a local supply of food, which is adaptable, but also it provides the fertilizers and the nutrients we need for on-ground plant production. I mean, I mentioned that last slide about carbon absorption, but actually I think the biggest opportunity for seaweed is the reduction of carbon because seaweed provides a much lower carbon alternative to many products. So petroleum-based products like plastic, chemical fertilizers, for example, or cotton and chemical tampons. So I've got a few examples here of things that actually make me a bit excited about the future of seaweed. So back in 2016, there was the study on Asparagopsis for methane reduction. And since 2016, we've seen it come a really long way. The commercialization of Asparagopsis now has kind of taken off. Trials now are being done with commercial cows, seeing how it affects their health, how it affects their meat production and biomass production. And from that, we're actually seeing in real world, while in the lab trials, we were seeing reduction of up to 90%. In real world trials, we were seeing 40%, which is actually really, really positive for something like that. Now, Asparagopsis is a tropical species, for those of you who know, but there have been trials in local species, especially from Chazak in Ireland, and they've had some really positive results. Only 9%, but still quite positive for methane reduction, and that's with a local species in Ireland. So that's really positive, and they use different methods as well of fermentation and production, basically. For those of you who have come across Nopla or Flexi or Solublue or Plantsy, might have seen these plastic alternative products. So Nopla, for example, has made plastic lining on cardboard boxes. That seems to be their most popular product at the moment. There's Plantsy have been talking about the laundry tablets, so the plastic lining around laundry tablets, making that from seaweed as well, so you don't get any microplastics, you get nothing from that. There's also Sway in the US who make hair in my mouth. You've got Sway who make the plastic straws. So instead of having paper straws, which actually have PFAS in them, or plastic straws, which obviously have plastic in them, we could actually be making straws out of seaweed. And they seem to stick together quite well. So really positive developments in plastic production. The big problem with bioplastic production is the price point just will never be able to compete with petroleum. So how do we get past that? And some of the government mandates, for example, ban on single-use plastics is a big one. The other thing as well is, where do we grow? If we need large amounts of biomass, where would we grow them? Well, one of the things that people have talked about is co-location with wind farms. So there's going to be lots of space out in these wind farms that can't be utilized for anything. So potentially growing seaweed out there is a big opportunity. And then actually we can see that there's quite a good interaction between the nutrient uptake and then also providing habitats and all sorts of biodiversity improving aspects over there as well. So I talked about the carbon value. I talked about some of the other values. What are the social and environmental values? Well, there's lots of words that are going around right now which seaweed fits into. So to be able to identify how much carbon, how much nitrogen, how much of anything that seaweed is absorbing, one of the big things you have to do are life cycle assessments. So life cycle assessments now coming, huge job opportunities within that, and they're really important to prove what you're doing and whether you're carbon neutral, carbon negative, or carbon positive. Biodiversity net gain law that's happening now. So policies are being passed within Scotland and also in England, that any activity you do in the marine environment has to improve biodiversity. So if there's anything that you do that it does not improve it, then you have to mitigate that somehow. And seaweed is a really good option for something that does improve biodiversity, and that's been proven now. But how do we quantify it is another question. You know, we want to make sure that we're able to make money from it, able to quantify it, and that's still a big leap for us economically speaking. Another couple of buzzwords: ecosystem services, nature-based solutions. Seaweed offers all of those things, especially in terms of nitrogen removal if they're located near fish farms or other things, and also the wording of regenerative or even restorative aquaculture. Both of those words coming up quite a lot. And I believe one of those is problematic, but I can't remember which one, so I put them both in there. So challenges and opportunities. Well, at the moment, there's still a heavy reliance on imports. Companies are making bioplastics, are still importing seaweed. A lot of companies that want to have seaweed products, they'll import seaweed from Asia or where it's substantially cheaper. We had our conference a few weeks ago, and our keynote speaker actually brought a pack of prawns from Lidl, and they had seaweed in them, and it was the seaweed salad that you would get in a Japanese restaurant. And he pointed out that the prawns themselves came from, I believe, Thailand. The seaweed came from China, and it was all packed in Venezuela, which, when all of those things are actually local, it seems really pointless to have to get so much carbon output in air miles just to get from point A to point B there. And get a product for £1.99 that you could buy at Lidl, which is absolutely insane to me. But these are the challenges that we're having to overcome. How do you provide seaweed at a price point that people are willing to take? There's also logistical issues. Anyone who's travelled around Scotland, especially this time of year, you know how difficult it is, especially getting to areas which are rural. So areas that have seaweed farms on the Isle of Skye, on the Isle of Mull, in Ardtow. How do you get your trucks, your refrigerated lorries, anything into those areas, especially during the summer months where it's particularly busy, and maybe some of those roads are only single track roads, or in the winter where it's particularly difficult to get around the roads, and they can be icy and not well gritted at times as well. Seeding supply, also a big one. The Scottish report that came out in 2022 estimated what the high growth rate by 2040 would be for seaweed, and they predicted something like 36,000 tonnes, and 30,000 of that, no, so it's 50,000 tonnes, and I think 30,000 of that would be cultivated, if I remember correctly. And I worked out how much seeding we needed if we stuck with twine, and I worked out that it was 200,000 kilometres of, or 20,000 kilometres, sorry, of seeded twine that we needed each year, which no one seeding supply could actually match. So we either need to switch to binder seaweed direct seeding at a much faster rate than we're currently doing, or we need to have many more seeding facilities. And unfortunately, getting that, again, economic viability of those facilities enough in advance of there being the market supply or market demand down the road is a really, really tricky area to be in. There are lots of regulatory burdens at the moment, and also fractures sector cohesion. So lots and lots of companies around Scotland, around the rest of the UK. Some are working together, some are not necessarily working that well together. So again, challenge of balancing all of that. This was taken from Ocean Rainforest. Last year at our conference, we had Oliver Gregerson, who came and did a speech for us. And one of the big things that he talked about was the scalability. And he talked about what price points we should be aiming for what markets. So if we look at the price points currently, we are looking at around, I'd say per wet weight, maybe £2 a kilo, which means that's about £2,000 a ton wet weight. And then we need to dry it, and then what the cost of drying is, maybe £1 a kilo. So the reality is you're going to get a tenth, because the seaweed is 90% water, and it's then suddenly substantially more expensive. So in that instance, if you then took that seaweed, the only thing it would be useful for would be high-end food and functional feed, and that's a really small-scale artisanal market. So how do we get the large-scale stuff? And we need to be able to spread it out across that. So we should be aiming for something like £3,500 per dry metric ton, which is sort of the amount there. Lidl, for example, have said that they would only be interested in seaweed if it was less than €3 per dry kilo. So that is the kind of point that we're aiming for if we want that large scale food ingredients market, and that's not where we're at the moment at all. Nowhere near that right now. So what are the emerging opportunities? Well, there's talk about biorefineries. So these large scale biorefineries would then either work to extract seaweed from, well, extract valuable compounds from seaweed like fucoidins or proteins, and then would then try and create some kind of zero waste model where we then used the pulp or the remains for other products, for materials, for textiles or whatever else. There is a lot of advancement in currently in offshore cultivation, but we need to be able to automate that a lot more. One of the reasons why seaweed is so expensive right now is because of the high labor cost, and being able to get that down and make things more automated would significantly bring that down. We need lots of research and development in breeding, growth rates, and how we make value-added products. And then there's also a lot of talk about integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. So how do we improve the biodiversity? How do we monetize the improvements in biodiversity? How do we create value out of the benefits that seaweed brings to the marine environment? So some of the infrastructure requirements that I've tried to point out here is, you know, there's a lot that we need. We need biorefineries and some small scale biorefineries probably, as well as some large ones. But then to run a biorefinery, if you take the example from Oceanium, you need 20,000 tons of seaweed a year. And where are we going to get 20,000 tons from? We need lots of landing and drying facilities close to farms, so people don't have to travel a long way, spend a lot of money on moving wet seaweed. That would obviously, in terms of logistics, be quite inhibiting. We need much larger scale farms. At the moment, the largest scale farm is 22 hectares, and we'd really like to see that improve based on a report that's currently being written from Hatch. To meet a high growth rate scenario, we only really need 200 to 300 hectares of seaweed farms to meet the quota each year, which would be not that much in the grand scheme of things. But to create those large scale farms, we probably need to do EIAs, again, quite cost inhibitive, unless we have a lot of money to put up front in the first place and get us there. We need to find those value add streams. Who are the markets? What do they want? How do they need it? What price are we aiming for? These are some of those key points here. Large scale nurseries that are able to scale up, that are able to provide the seaweed and be able to provide large amounts of seaweed that we can direct seed as well. We need lots of R&D facilities. That's for new product development. That's to look at biostimulants efficacy. That's to look at fucoidins. That's to do all sorts of research development, not only in the farming stage, but also in the value add stage. And unfortunately, lab testing, now I had to put in there because things are slightly different now. I believe one lab bought a lot of different labs within the UK and has hiked up the cost a little bit. So things are much more expensive now and less able to get lab testing done at a decent price point within the UK, which is a real shame. So some of the government support and regulations that we've seen, there is government support for research and development. So we've seen UKRA has come out with various funds. There's also the Marine Fund Scotland grant. There's also iBioIC, SAKE was around. Unfortunately, they're currently being disbanded, but in all likelihood, I think we are going to see government support for the blue economy come out in a different way. I've heard things about research clusters, so I am excited to see what the government's going to provide in terms of support. They're currently working on NMP2. There's also the Vision for Sustainable Aquaculture that came out. They're looking at biodiversity policies. They're also looking at restoration initiatives. So there is a lot of support for the green sector and for things that improve the environment. But again, how to make that economically viable is a big question mark. There is favourable policy for small to medium farms, and the previous National Marine Plan, not NMP2, but the previous one, which we have to talk about if you're putting in a marine licence, wants all of these things, and I believe that seaweed does provide for all 5 of those points. So industry trends, I did touch on a couple of products. I talked on a couple of industries. This was taken from the World Bank report. So one of the things that they really pointed out in this is that in terms of short-term things that are ready to go right now are biostimulants and animal feeds, because a lot of the time you don't need to do much to them. You don't need to prove much. You don't need to, it just comes as a low carbon alternative to another product. The reality and actual fact is not the case, I think. This is a very romanticized graph, and I think a lot of people pull from it. But the burden of proof is still quite high for even all of these products. So animal feeds, you can't just give cows seaweed or kelps because of their high levels of iodine and in some cases bromoforms as well, which might make them sick. So how do we figure out which species are actually suitable? How do we figure out whether we need to extract anything from them? How do we figure out if the biostimulant actually improves the soil? Is it a soil enhancer? Is it a root growth? Does it improve the fruit? It probably does a lot of these things, and every species that you look at will be slightly different. So it's really important to take the time to go through the research and development, and unfortunately have that burden of proof ahead of going to market. We've also, I didn't realize we were so far along. Sorry, I should probably give some time for questions and answers at the end. But yeah, okay, so the trends there is a focus on carbon reduction. There is a focus on sustainable sourcing. When we look at what people want, they do want sustainability, but ultimately they actually want a low price point. And if they're buying food, they want it tasty. You know, the number one priority is not always what you think it's going to be. So recommendations for industry growth. So at the moment, you've got APPGs, which are government organisations. We need one for the seaweed industry. I think there is one for shellfish. There is one for aquaculture, I believe, and I'd really like one for seaweed. So I half finished that fourth point. I realised I just put PR. I don't even know what that was. So we want seed banks and nurseries across the UK, as I said, and ideally we'd like to subsidise the seed. So in Ireland, for example, farms were kick-started because they were subsidised for their seed. So anything that you put out was paid for by the government. So the risk was then taken away from the farmer. They just needed to grow it, and as long as they could find a buyer. Right now, farmers need a lot of upfront money, and they don't even know if the buyer will be there at the end of the 6 to 8 months of their grow out period, which is very unfortunate, having so much risk right at the beginning. We need to have those post-harvest facilities and biorefineries, and we need to make sure that there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration between research industry and government. Countries like South Korea have been really successful because they've managed to tie together those three sectors. So conclusions, I mean, the seaweed sector needs to do quite a lot to get from point A to B. There are lots of different routes to market. So what's the most promising? What is the safest? How do we de-risk from the farmer? And also marketing strategies. So is it because the buyer's not buying enough that we're not quite meeting that quota, or is it because the industries aren't bought in yet? They don't quite know. You know, the number of companies I've spoken to who get calls from companies who say, yeah, I want to buy seaweed, and they go, well, great. What of the 600 different species would you like to buy? It's a challenge for the buyer as well as for the seller to get that information across and make sure that everyone's as educated as they can be about the sector. And I think that's it. Thank you.